Amarna appeared under the sun, no monuments, no shadows, only the light of Aten flooding rough stone slabs. The priests moved with absolute precision. At the center of the ritual was Pharaoh and a woman standing where no woman should stand, between the divine and the human. She did not witness power. She intercepted it. Her body blocked the divine axis. Her gestures completed the ritual. No one stopped her. In the age of Aten, only those who stood in that line could rule Egypt. She stood there. That image still exists as stone carving, not hidden in texts but placed where everyone could see. On reliefs at Amarna, that scene appears clearly. A king gripping the hair of a bound enemy. Arm raised high, mace ready to strike. This is the most ancient visual language of Egyptian power, defeating enemies, turning violence into legitimacy. What is shocking is not that act. Egypt had carved this image for thousands of years. What breaks the pattern is the body performing that act. The figure in the painting wears the kepresh, the blue war crown. The posture is rigid, practiced standard. Body proportions conform to royal convention. But the name attached to the painting is not the pharaoh's name. It is Nefertiti. Never before had any queen been depicted here. Not in symbolic sense, not in metaphorical sense, not even as a divine extension. This space, the moment of permitted violence, belonged only to kings. This is where order proves itself by eliminating chaos. To step there is to assert the right to kill in the name of the cosmos. Nefertiti stepped there without hesitation. She did not stand behind Akhenaten, nor was she his reflection at smaller scale. In some reliefs, she completely replaces him. Enemies kneel. Bindings tighten. The mace is real. The implication is very clear. This woman is not protected by power, but holds power itself. The court, allowing that statue to exist, is recognition itself. That decision is more important than the sculpture itself. Amarna art was controlled, ideological, precisely curated. Every relief was approved. Every wall is a declaration. Nothing appeared randomly. Nefertiti being displayed here means resistance had failed or never fully formed. The priesthood did not erase it. The bureaucracy did not correct it. The military did not object either. The taboo was broken silently. This is how power truly shifts in empires, not by declarations, but by images that exist long enough to become normal. People are not told who Nefertiti is. No genealogy, no justification, no explanatory annotation. They are forced to accept the truth before knowing the reason. A woman performs royal violence and the state endorses it. Meaning will be clarified later. In Egyptian political theology, violence is not cruelty but maintenance. The king does not kill because he is cruel. He kills because the world will decay without his intervention. He raises the staff to prevent decay because hesitation is invitation to collapse. By placing Nefertiti here, the regime rewrote the equation. Order no longer comes only from masculinity or bloodline. It comes from alignment with Aten. Anyone who connects with this god can strike. This is the price of religious revolution. Akhenaten's new theological system stripped power from old gods and institutions. The Amun Church lost its monopoly on legitimacy. Temples lost land. Rituals became centralized, simplified, and public. But a gap appeared where power had previously been protected by tradition. Someone had to assume that position. Nefertiti did not need to ask permission. She assumed that role visually, ritually, and symbolically before it could be debated. By the time anyone questioned it, the answer had been carved into the city walls. The rule of the game: if the image is maintained, power is maintained. If power is maintained, opposition becomes heresy. However, that image also created a problem it could not solve, because violence often leads to comparison. When Nefertiti is depicted as one who defeats enemies, she is judged by the same standards as kings. Could she defend borders? Could she win loyalty beyond ritual? Could theology replace the military? The relief preserves a perfect moment, but reality does not. Egypt's enemies did not disappear just because the god Aten willed it. Vassal states hesitated. Letters went unanswered. Borders contracted. The empire's outer ring sensed instability at the center. Inside the court, the message became clearer. This woman had stepped into the most dangerous territory, not the battlefield but expectation. She had won the right to strike. Now she had to prove she could keep the world stable afterward. The picture does not show what happens next. It never does. But from this moment on, Nefertiti was no longer just part of a religious experiment. She was a political reality. And reality in empires like Egypt demands consequences. The 14th century before the Common Era witnessed Egypt reaching its territorial peak and silent confidence. Gold was transported from Nubia northward. Grain was transported along the Nile as regularly as machinery. Diplomacy stretched from Anatolia to the Levant. On the surface, the empire looked stable, even bored with its own power. But beneath that shell, control no longer rested solely with the throne. It was shared uncomfortably with institutions older than any living king. The center of that tension was the priesthood of Amun. Through generations, they had accumulated land, manpower, storage, and power rivaling the palace. Their temples were economic engines. Their rituals regulated time itself. Pharaoh still wore the crown, but the divine spoke through another hierarchy. Power was divided, and everyone pretended the division did not exist. This is the world Nefertiti entered, not as heir, not as conqueror, but as an anomaly. Her origins are barely documented. No birth certificate, no divine lineage, no childhood memories carved on temple walls. The most plausible hypothesis suggests she is the daughter of Ai, a court official whose influence grew increasingly strong but silently. If true, this explains both her access to power and her vulnerability. She is near power but not protected by it. She does not carry royal blood that demands respect. Everything she achieves must be defended immediately. That absence is crucial. In Egypt, lineage is not merely ancestry. It is protective armor. It extends time when mistakes are made. It reduces resistance. Nefertiti has none of that. She stepped onto a stage built for gods and kings, and by rules everyone knows she does not belong there. That is precisely why she is useful. Amenhotep IV, who later changed his name to Akhenaten, inherited a system he did not trust. Too many gods. Their priests entrenched in power. Rituals increasingly complex, opaque, and harder to reform. Challenging them directly would fracture the state. Coexisting with them would weaken his power. He needed an alternative, legitimate structure, one not dependent on the old order's power. Nefertiti appeared without carrying any institutional burden. No priest claimed her. No temple controlled her story. She was uncultivated land. This marriage was political, but not in the conventional way. It did not unite dynasties. It created a new axis. She became great royal wife, but the title did not capture the full transformation. From the beginning, she was present. Not just mentioned, but repeatedly mentioned. Her images appeared with unusual frequency, not as decoration, but as presence. The court recognized the pattern before understanding it. Egyptian queens always had important symbolic meaning. They ensured succession. They embodied stability. They smoothed power transitions. But they were not ideology shapers. Nefertiti was different. She was placed where ideas were being tested, not where lineage was displayed. Her lack of noble lineage became a feature. She represented a break with the notion that inheritance is the primary reason to rule. At a moment when the king was preparing to shatter divine tradition, she embodied that same logic socially. Power is not natural. It is constructed. This inversion made everyone uncomfortable. For the priesthood, she was not accountable. They could not trace her power's source to a god they controlled. For the nobility, she was unpredictable. She owed them nothing. For foreign courts, she was incomprehensible. Their diplomatic language had no words to describe her role. Yet she remained present, attending ceremonies, receiving homage, speaking through images that spread faster than any decree. Amarna amplified this effect. When the court abandoned Thebes and built a new capital from zero, the power hierarchy became deliberately clear. No more ancient neighborhoods to hide behind. No more inherited sanctuaries. Every wall was new. Every decorative pattern was created intentionally. In this city, power had to constantly display itself or cease to exist. Nefertiti shone brighter under attention. She was not elevated gradually. She appeared in completed form. The artwork does not show her learning process, but shows her actions. performing rituals, offering sacrifices, standing side by side with Akhenaten as if that had always been the inherent arrangement. The scale of this experiment was immense. Egypt was not a city-state. It was an empire dependent on daily processes, from grain transport tax records to garrisons. The religious system was the main software coordinating everything. Rewriting that code risked total collapse. This is the core issue in Nefertiti's rise. Not whether a woman could hold power, but whether power could detach from its oldest structure and survive. She is the central figure of that question. Her presence showed the new order did not require bloodline purity. It required alignment between belief, action, and loyalty to a visible God expressed through visible bodies. But such a large stage also amplifies failure as much as success. Each appearance increased the cost of withdrawal. Each ritual performed in her name deepened commitment. No path back to partial reform. Either the system would stabilize around this new center or it would tear itself apart in the process. Nefertiti understood this before most court members. Her power was not inherited, so it could not be hoarded. It only existed as long as it was used convincingly. One moment of hesitation would collapse the narrative, but she never hesitated. By the time her name became familiar, the structure that elevated her was firmly consolidated. Old rules still existed, but they no longer explained what people were witnessing. A woman without royal blood standing at the center of the empire's most radical transformation. This is not a story about destiny. This is a story about timing. A system cracked. A gap appeared. Someone unqualified stepped in and absolutely refused to leave. Egypt had had many queens, but it had never witnessed this combination before. And once it existed, it could not be considered temporary. Nefertiti's power did not appear suddenly because it was not improvised. Before Amarna, before Aten became doctrine, she was formed inside the palace at Thebes, where power remained ritualized, stratified, and cautious. This is where she learned how Egypt truly operated, not in theory, but in practice. Who was allowed to speak first? Who had to wait? Which silence meant refusal and which silence meant consent? Her training was not martial. It was theological and procedural. She learned the grammar of ritual, the timing of offerings, and how to turn gestures into legitimacy. In Egypt, belief was not private. Controlling ritual was controlling perception. Controlling perception was controlling the state. She studied the gods not as abstract concepts, but as institutions. Each god had its own constituency. Each cult had land, manpower, and allies. Nefertiti learned the intersections and breaks of these networks. She recognized that theology was not faith but infrastructure. This knowledge was crucial when Amenhotep IV began acting. His dissatisfaction with the old order was not hidden. Aten appeared first as an emphasis, not as a replacement. More hymns appeared. Position became more prominent. Fewer intermediaries. The change proceeded gradually enough to avoid confusion, but carefully enough to show intent. Nefertiti was present at every stage, not as decoration, but as participant. Their marriage formalized this alliance. When she became great royal wife, the title indicated status, but behavior indicated something else. She was involved in decisions that wives were not allowed to touch. She appeared in contexts implying shared responsibility. Visual language changed to match reality. Art recorded this transformation carefully. Nefertiti was not diminished. She was not softened. Her size was proportional to the king. Her gestures mirrored his gestures precisely. This symmetry was unprecedented. When it broke convention, it was because the state needed a new explanation of itself. Amarna completed the transition. This city was not just a capital. It was a controlled environment. No more inherited priestly class. No more inherited sacred land. Every role had to be redefined from scratch. For Akhenaten, this was liberation. For Nefertiti, this was opportunity. She assumed unprecedented functions because old functions no longer fit. Aten needed direct mediation. The god did not speak through oracles or monuments. He shone. Someone had to transform that abstraction into order. That task could not be delegated to dispersed priests. It had to be centralized. Nefertiti became that center. She performed rituals beside the king, not as assistant but as companion. In some scenes she leads, in others she completes actions the king began. The division of labor was precise. This was not symbolic equality. This was functional equality, the game rule. When a system is rewritten, those who grasp the new rules first gain superior power. Nefertiti learned faster than anyone else. Her power grew through repetition. Each ritual reinforced it. Each public appearance normalized it. The court adapted, because adapting was safer than opposing. Officials adjusted their behavior. Titles expanded. Language changed subtly to match reality that did not exist a generation earlier. This was not personal magnetism. This was discipline. She did not seek admiration. She sought coherence. Her strength depended on the Aten system operating clearly and continuously. Any ambiguity led to challenge, so she chose to eliminate that ambiguity. By the time opposition formed, clearly they had lost the intuitive argument. People had witnessed her behaving as ruler too many times to accept her absence. But this configuration harbored an unforeseen cost, because the role she held had no precedent, no tradition to soften failure, no script for succession. It only worked effectively as long as she and Akhenaten remained present, aligned in purpose, and undisputed. Nefertiti understood this fragility. Training had taught her what happens when institutions develop beyond their foundation. So she aimed for permanence, more images, more inscriptions, more repetition. If the system wanted to survive, it had to become inevitable. In that moment, that was true. The court operated. Rituals proceeded. Aten's light flooded every surface. The royal family became the visible mechanism through which the cosmos operated. And Nefertiti stood at the center of it all, not as a wife elevated by marriage, but as a partner forged by necessity. She had been trained for a role Egypt had no language to express, and she performed it perfectly. The problem was not whether she was competent. The problem was whether the world she was helping build could survive when perfection was no longer enough. The decision was not announced in advance. It was executed. One ritual changed, then another. A god's name was omitted. A temple received less grain. A hymn was rewritten, so light replaced lineage. By the time the old order understood what was happening, the center had shifted. Aten was no longer the supreme god. Aten was the only god that mattered. This was not abstraction. This was restructuring. Polytheism dispersed power across space, time, and class. Different regions served different cults. Different crises invoked different gods. This system was flexible, resilient, and impossible to fully control. Atenism compressed that complexity into a single channel. One God, one source, one visible path between heaven and earth. That path went through royalty. Nefertiti's role expanded accordingly. She was no longer merely a ritual performer. She became co-mediator. Aten accepted no intermediaries, but mediation still existed. It was expressed through bodies. Light came to the world through bodies permitted to receive it. Those bodies were limited, public, named. Her presence beside Akhenaten became constant. Reliefs show sun rays ending in tiny hands, directly bestowing life to their faces. The implication was unmistakable. Power was not transmitted through tradition. It was transmitted through proximity. This was a revolutionary message in an empire built on memory. By binding power to belief rather than lineage, the Aten regime broke Egypt's most durable formula. Legitimacy was no longer automatically inherited. It had to be renewed through correct alignment with divine will publicly demonstrated. King and queen did not rule because they were born with power. They ruled because they were chosen continuously. Nefertiti understood the danger and advantage of this change. Belief is easily changeable. It can strengthen faster than loyalty and can also vanish quickly. To stabilize it, she emphasized transparency. More rituals, more public ceremonies, more images to carve the new reality into stone before doubt could form. She appeared not as consort but as center. In some scenes, she offered sacrifices directly to Aten without the king's presence. In others, she completed rituals that women could not previously perform. Boundaries became blurred because old boundaries belonged to gods who no longer ruled. The rule of the game. When power claims itself as inevitable, it tolerates no rivals, including tradition. The Amun priesthood became obstacle rather than partner. Their assets were redirected. Their rituals were sidelined. Their power was stripped silently. They were not attacked directly, but they were deprived of life's meaning. But theology cannot substitute for administrative management. As Atenism consolidated its position at the center, the empire's border regions began to waver. Vassals still needed protection. Garrisons still needed supplies. Diplomacy still needed attention. The god of light did not respond to letters from border kings. The bureaucracy did, and it was overloaded. This is when the system began showing overload. Nefertiti remained focused on consistency. If the new order wanted to survive, it had to be complete. Half-hearted belief was worse than no belief. She pushed the ritual system harder, expanded its scope, drove it deeper into daily life. The royal family became not just rulers, but living proof that Aten's grace sustained the world. Initially it worked. The court was streamlined. The city operated smoothly. Intuitive argument refuted all doubt. Egypt looked unified because its center was brilliant, radiant, impossible to ignore. But power concentrated so narrowly has no buffer capacity. When failures occurred, when foreign allies abandoned, when borders were tested, theology offered no explanation, satisfying those who lost land or status. Aten rewarded loyalty, not competence. This difference began to matter. Nefertiti sensed the shift. Her role changed subtly. She was no longer just the embodiment of belief. She became belief's defender. Rituals continued, but focus became harder. Certainty replaced persuasion. The family remained the universe's center, but the universe no longer cooperated. A system built on transparency cannot hide its failures. Each unanswered letter, each lost outpost, each whispered doubt reflected back on those who claimed exclusive access to the divine. This is the paradox of Atenism. By eliminating intermediaries, it eliminated scapegoats. Responsibility became absolute. Nefertiti had helped build a theology where power could not separate from belief. Now belief had to explain a world that refused to maintain order. Escalation was inevitable. When belief no longer sufficed to ensure stability, power would seek another language. And Nefertiti was ready to speak it. The 12th regnal year was designed to demonstrate permanence. A grand festival occurred at Amarna, meticulously staged, publicly relentless. Foreign delegations arrived with tribute. Gold, livestock, textiles, prisoners, everything demonstrating the empire's reach was displayed under the sun. The message was simple: the system works effectively. The divine is pleased with it. The power center remains firm. Nefertiti stood at the picture's center. Her presence was absolutely total. She presided over rituals received, offerings appeared with stature equal to the king. Nothing ambiguous about her position. If Atenism had a human interface, it was her. The court had adapted. The people had learned the gestures. In that moment, the experiment seemed complete. This was the peak. This was also the moment when costs could no longer be delayed. Beyond the ritual core, the empire was gradually weakening. The Amarna letters record a different reality, one of unanswered pleas, constantly shifting alliances, and regional governors forced to choose between loyalty and survival. The central government was busy consolidating the theological system, while the periphery silently weakened. Ritual power could not push back encroachment. Contradiction became unavoidable. If Aten's grace ensured order, why did chaos still exist? If legitimacy came directly from the divine, why did the world resist unification? These questions were not discussed among priests. They were discussed among administrators, generals, and foreign clients who viewed the empire as a logistic system rather than theology. Nefertiti became the focus of this tension not because she was weak, but because she was too prominent. Her power was expressed through ritual, concentrated, and unmistakable. When things did not go smoothly, there was no institutional support. The system she had helped build offered no other explanation. Power not dispersed creates clarity. It also creates targets. At court, alliances tightened. Influential officials dependent on the old religious economy saw no path back. The Aten regime had broken their influence without providing replacement. Resentment need not lead to rebellion to be dangerous. It only needs patience. The succession problem intensified tension. Atenism had redefined legitimacy but had not resolved inheritance. Royal princesses had prominent positions, ritual significance, but by convention could not be used politically. There was a male heir, but his succession was fragile, dependent on a system already under strain. Nefertiti's prominent position complicated all calculations. As long as she stood at center, the regime would project confidence. But that very prominence made her an obstacle for those planning to maintain power after Akhenaten. She had become indispensable. That was the problem. The rule of the game. When a system cannot imagine existence without a certain figure, that figure becomes a burden. The redirection proceeded subtly. No condemnation, no fall from grace. Instead, focus shifted. New titles appeared in unexpected places. Military language reappeared in royal symbolism. Tone became harder from enlightenment to defense. External pressure drove the change. Egypt could not pursue pure theology when borders demanded strength. Someone had to reassert control in language rivals understood. Nefertiti went first. Her previous appearances in violent scenes now carried new meaning. Images of her punishing enemies were no longer ideological provocations. They were precedents. They suggested capabilities beyond ritual, power beyond belief. The regime began testing another balance. Theology remained, but it was no longer enough. Atenism had to be defended, not just enacted. This is when Nefertiti's role shifted from symbol to solution. She assumed the defender role, keeper of the new order, rather than its brilliant demonstration. The change was not announced. It was implied through shifts in emphasis. More combat images, fewer intimate family scenes, a realignment of presence. But this transition exposed a deeper fracture. The Aten system was built to eliminate rivals by centralizing mediation. Now, it required coercion. Coercion required delegation, hierarchy, and compulsion, precisely the structures the reform had dismantled. Nefertiti could not be both exclusive mediator and dispersed commander forever. The system asked her to resolve contradictions it created. At the peak of power, power becomes fragile. The 12th year festival is remembered as a triumph. In hindsight, it was a milestone. Everything after was improvisation under pressure. Rituals continued, but certainty gradually disappeared. The world outside Amarna no longer just reacted to light. Nefertiti stood at the center of a regime that had reached maximum cohesion. Any further pressure would not shake it. It would collapse. She had risen higher than any queen before. She had redefined the very concept of legitimacy. And by doing so, she had turned herself into the question Egypt could no longer avoid answering. Then the name would no longer appear. Not erased, not condemned, simply absent. In inscriptions that once repeated her titles with obsessive regularity, Nefertiti vanished. No explanation, no mourning reserved for her. The court continued as if nothing changed, which is how power signals something decisive has occurred. Instead, a new name entered the record, Neferuaten. The titles are royal, not consort, not regent, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, beloved of Aten. The language was used carefully, but the claim was absolute. This was not a manager. This was a ruler. Timing is crucial. This disappearance occurred after Atenism's peak, after theology failed to stabilize the empire and before the old order could reassert itself. The system needed continuity without retreat. It needed strength without admitting error. Neferuaten solved that problem. The identity behind this name remains controversial. Ancient sources do not clarify it. Some argue it was a male relative. Others point to a brief co-regency. But the collected evidence titles ideological continuity, Nefertiti's sudden disappearance all lean one direction. This was not replacement. This was transformation. The emerging leader continued developing Atenist theology, but with an important shift. Language became less intimate, more formal. Family withdrew from center position. The state reasserted its role as an instrument rather than a revelation. Images associated with Neferuaten emphasize control rather than brilliance. Power increasingly consolidated. War imagery returned with clear purpose rather than provocation. The regime no longer tried to convince the world it was right. It was just trying to survive. If Nefertiti is Nefertiti, this is the final evolution of her power. She did not defend the system as queen. She reigned in it as king. The rule of the game. When legitimacy breaks down, the system does not ask who you are. The system asks what you can stabilize. This move resolved multiple crises simultaneously. It bypassed the problem of female power without acknowledging its failure. It preserved Atenism without binding it completely to a single, theophanic configuration. It created a ruler who could lead in the language of kingship without abandoning the new theology. But it also showed the regime's limitations. Nefertiti ruled for a short time. Records fragmented almost immediately. The pace of change accelerated. Titles changed. Names overlapped. The state no longer confidently told his name still bore Aten's mark, but his position was precarious. He could not rule alone. He was surrounded by people who had survived every ideological transformation without complete loyalty to any. I was one of them. So was Horemheb. They understood what the Aten regime never fully accepted. Theology can justify power, but it cannot replace institutions forever. The military needs chain of command. The bureaucracy needs stability. The empire needs redundancy. When Nefertiti disappeared from records as suddenly as she appeared, no resistance formed. That silence was decisive. It meant the system no longer depended on her presence. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun. Aten receded. Amun returned, not for revenge but for healing. Temples reopened. Ancient rituals resumed. People adapted with astonishing speed. Amarna was abandoned. The city that once proclaimed itself the universe's center now became a quarry. Its stone was reused. Reliefs were vandalized. Names were systematically chiseled out. This was not angry erasure. This was administrative cleanup. Nefertiti suffered a special fate. She was not condemned as heretic. She was not remembered as ruler. She was reduced to aesthetic symbol. Her political actions disappeared from the story. Her theological role was obscured. What remained was only beauty, safe, passive, easily consumed, a face without meaning. The bust in Berlin would later clarify this distortion. Perfect symmetry, detached serenity, no context, no power. The 18th Dynasty's most radical figure became an object. But this erasure was not yet complete. Because systems remember what humans try to forget. The Aten experiment failed, but it left echoes. It proved that legitimacy could be created, that ritual could be redesigned, that gender was not a technical barrier to power when institutions were restructured based on performance rather than lineage. Nefertiti's brief reign exposed the story's final truth. Power did not reject Nefertiti because she was incompetent. It absorbed her, then discarded her when stability demanded another shape. She did not lose. And in empires, that is the most dangerous transition. Amarna was destroyed stone by stone. Names erased. Images smashed or buried. This project was not revenge. It was repair. History was rewritten to restore continuity, and continuity demanded forgetting. Nefertiti was recreated rather than destroyed. Her reign became inexpressible in words. Her power was stripped of context and reduced to beauty. A face remained where a system once reigned, but erasure is never total. The Berlin bust brought her back to public view not as ruler but as icon. Debates about ownership, memory, and repatriation pulled her back into global consciousness. What should have been silent became controversial issue. She did not inherit power. She reshaped how power operated. That is why her trace remains. Systems collapse. Images endure forever. And when history tries to completely erase a figure, it often shows how dangerous that figure once was. If she truly did not matter, Egypt would not have worked so hard to make her disappear. So the question remains, why do we still see her to this day?